Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Watch Us Thrive podcast. I'm super excited to mention that we have our first guest doctor on the show. She's an Afro-Latina too. So that's like just one on top of the other. There's not a lot of women that look like you in these spaces. So I'm very honored to have you here to share your story and some much needed wisdom about something that I talk about a lot on this show. We're going to be focusing around healing, trauma, intergenerational trauma, which if you've been around for a long time, you know that's my jam. That's what we talk about. So Dr. Mariel Buqué, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be with you.
Yes, absolutely. So let's get into an introduction in your own words for anyone who's meeting you for the first time. Let us know who you are and what you do.
I love this. So I'd like to start off with some of what you mentioned. I'm an Afro-Dominican born in the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo, and I came to the US when I was 5. And I am also a doctor of psychology. So I actually specialize in mental health, and I specifically specialize in trauma and trauma healing. And my first book, hopefully of many, but it is my baby, is coming out on January 2nd, which is Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma, which really enmeshes like all of the passions that I have around generational healing, and also brings in stories from my family, from my own healing, and then also from my office, my therapy office. So it's a gift that I can't wait for the world to have in their hands.
And I definitely want to learn more about the book and why you decided to become a psychologist, specifically in this space. But before we do that, with every guest that comes on the show, we always go back to childhood. This is something that I'm sure you attest to, but for me, I say all the time on my show that a lot of the things that we deal with during that time period, it really shapes us into who we become as adults. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about, as much as you're comfortable with talking about, but what did life look like for baby Mariel growing up?
Interestingly enough, I actually have on one of my screens that I have right here on my desk, I have baby Mariel, just as a reminder, of everything that I do, also on her behalf and on behalf of really a lot of our inner niñas or inner children, right? Or inner niñez for all of us, really. The unfortunate reality of my childhood is that it wasn't a childhood that was really stable. So I actually did have incredibly, and still do, incredibly loving parents. So I have been like really, really lucky in that regard. But unfortunately, our family history was actually tainted by a separation based on immigration law. And it made it so that our family suffered so much. So imagine like my parents are still together, people that are in a relationship, but having a relationship sees apart, right? Like my dad in the Dominican Republic, my mother here in the US with my sister and I. And it made life always feel like melancholy. Like it always had this flavor of yearning, and we were like kind of like not experiencing the fullness of the love of a father that truly loved us. And I'm talking about the 90s, right? So like we had calling cards back then. We didn't even have like FaceTime like you do now. We had calling cards and we had letters. And so like the absence of my father was deeply felt. And even recently, because my parents and I and my sister, we have very profound generational healing conversations, I can tell how much it actually pains my parents to even reflect on those times where, from the moment when I was 3 years old until basically I was 21, we didn't have him around mostly, right? And so I think, even with the love that was reflected in my childhood, there was always this yearning and this like experience of trauma by way of the imposition of immigration law and policy that created this awful separation in my family. And I know that that's the case for a lot of us immigrants, a lot of us Latinos. Like we have like parents or family members who we have to have these long distance relationships with. And it creates a fracturing that stays with you for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like a hole that's never really truly filled, and it's something that you carry along with you. And I appreciate you for sharing that because I know so many people can relate to that, not having that father figure or mother figure in their life that can be so detrimental to them when they get older. So, how was it like for you as you got older? And then talk about why you decided to come into this space of being that generational trauma healer and expert. Take us on that journey.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, psychology is like, it's my second career. I actually went into media studies and I actually was in advertising in New York doing the whole like ad executive thing for a few years. And I was so unfulfilled with that life because it was literally capitalism in a nutshell, like in one position, right? Making like big brands a lot of money. And I just didn't feel like I was really kind of like living out my soul's mission. And so what I did is I saw that there were volunteer opportunities in my hometown in Newark, New Jersey. And I was like, I'll just do that on the weekends. So every weekend, sometimes at night, I started volunteering. And that volunteer work led me down the path of learning that mental health was even a thing. I didn't even know it was an actual profession or anything I could get into, which is wild. But beyond that, I was like, oh my goodness, like I can probably do more of this. But simultaneously, I was actually going into my first therapy session because I had to have surgery around that time, my first surgery ever. And I was terrified. And a fellow Latina who was my colleague was like, I go to therapy and you might want to try it out. And in my first therapy session, that therapist was like, I think you should think about being a therapist. So between that message and the fact that I was volunteering already in the mental health world in my hometown, eventually within 2 years' time, I was like, I just got to do it. And I just left the industry and I went back to grad school for 8 years, 8 brutal years.
Yes, I'm sure. Did you get any pushback from your family in regards to you making that shift in your career? Because I know that can be for a lot of the first gens. I'm not first gen, I'm second generation, but you're ticking off all the boxes and you're doing all the things that you think you should be doing. And then once you go against the grain, let's say, and the family's like, well, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you changing? Did you get any of that kind of feedback from your family?
My family is incredibly supportive, so I actually didn't get that feedback. I think the feedback that I got that was resistance based was mostly when I was already doing the healing work and then I was trying to bring them into that healing journey with me. And first of all, I didn't know how to express the fact that I wanted them to heal. I still struggle with it, even as a psychologist. Sometimes I'm like, like you just go into these elevated conversations with my parents about them needing to engage in some healing practices to help them settle themselves because they're very
Yes.
elevated
Yes.
Latinos. So it was mostly that where I would come back home and I would be like, you got to do this because this is what I'm learning can really help us and heal us and all this. And nobody was listening. It was really hard at the beginning.
I can relate to that so much. I've told my mom so many times, love her to death, but she needs some therapy. But she's very like, stuck in her ways. I don't need therapy. That's not for me. And then I've come to the point now that I just got to take her for who she is. But I can absolutely relate to like trying to, especially when you're on this like personal development journey, your whole mindset shifts and you want the people around you to shift with you, but that's not my responsibility to do that. You know what I mean? So it's like a back and forth kind of situation that you have to go through.
Yeah. And I think, to your statement, like you said, I love her to death, but she needs therapy. I think that the reality of that statement is more like, I love her to death. And that's why I want to push her into her own healing because I want to see this for her. And I think that that's the thing is that most of us are like really kind of like have in our hearts, like we want the people that we love to also feel the healing, the elevation, the freedom from like all the terrible pain that we've been carrying around for generations. Like we want that for them. And so that's why we push. That's why us millennials and like even like kind of the older Gen Z even are like, no, you have to do some of the healing. And I think that it comes from a place of deep love.
Yeah, absolutely. It's never to be malicious or be like, I'm better than you. It's never that kind of conversation. But I do appreciate this generation now that we are kind of like the cycle breakers when it comes to changing the narrative around healing and personal development. And I would love for you to talk about, because I know you're very big. I did a little bit of research about you before you came on. And I know that you're very into bringing in your culture and your background to the way that you practice your healing and your education. So, how has that influenced the way that you approach the healing from intergenerational trauma using your background and your culture?
It fully informs it. Like, that's why in my bio now, like I say that I practice holistic healing and that I practice from a perspective of integrating ancient and indigenous healing traditions into the practice that I do. And what I mean by ancient is what has been around for a millennia, right? Like that our ancestors knew to do in order to help us heal. And also indigenous, meaning indigenous to the lands that we come from and the people that we come from, who also held a lot of wisdom about how do we heal before we even had modern medicine or westernized ways of like thinking about health and throwing pills at people that make them even more sick. Like we had other kinds of medicine. And so in my own journey towards helping to heal myself, helping to heal my family, and helping to find better healing methods for the clients that I have been so incredibly honored to serve, I started gathering a lot of that wisdom and started practicing that wisdom in order to also retain it for myself and get back to my own roots, but really integrate the true healing and whole person healing that I knew would be helpful. But I happen to also have been very lucky in that in my program, I had two forms of training that were specifically orienting me around how to do this work from a cultural lens, which I don't think a lot of people tend to have. One, because like our program actually started with me telling my professor, my Latina professor, can you please do this? And she decided to then like install the program into it's a Latina mental health concentration. She developed it. I helped her with some of the research to, send it to the state so that they could approve it. And then she implemented it. And I was the first doctoral student to graduate from that Latina mental health concentration at Columbia University. And so like
Yes,
she listened to me.
congratulations.
Thank you. And it was like such an honor. And also I learned a lot of those like beautiful cultural integrations of the work into the therapeutic space that I was creating. And then in addition to that, I also, with that same professor, I was her fellow, her holistic mental health fellow for 3 years. And she also put me across the Columbia Medical Center, different clinics that helped me to understand how to practice holistic mental health. So I was just incredibly lucky to have beautiful mentors to help integrate me into the work in a way that's really informed how I practice now.
I love that so much. Congratulations to you. That is major. You're paving the way for others to continue the legacy that you're building. So I love that for you so much.
Thank
And
you.
there's something that I saw on your Instagram that you have this thing you started during the pandemic called Tea Time. Talk a little bit about that and how has that been so beneficial in the way that you practice using your culture and your background?
Well, tea time, it actually started from two places. So the first was, I was already having tea all the time in my home because my mother makes tea almost every day. And she makes tea, especially when we're sick. And we always say, like, drink one of mom's teas, you will go from having the flu to zero flu in one day, like literally.
Yep. That and some vapor, some Vicks vapor.
Yeah. Like we knew the things, right? Like
Yes.
we know what helps. And mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandfathers and individuals, even those who don't operate within the binary, like we get it. And I then started integrating tea drinking as a tea ceremony practice into my actual day to day. And in addition to that, I started learning about my grandmother's use of tea to help heal my mother and her siblings. And I was like, this is so beautiful. And it almost kind of like was a moment that I would be connected to. Her name is Mama Tutuna. I would be connected to her like in like drinking my tea mindfully, just not doing anything else. And in the pandemic, I was doing that. And then I was like, you know what? We're feeling really lonely. Like we need a lot of help right now. Let me see if there's a way that I could, like, almost kind of how they say in theater, break the fourth wall and talk directly to the camera, directly to people and say, let's have tea. Let me tell you about a couple things that can be helpful for you right now in this really, really collective
Dark place.
grief that we're experiencing, like during the pandemic. And then back then we had also, a lot of the police murders upon Black and Latinx folks, and the racial uprisings were a place of liberation for us, but also causing us to like feel overexerted in even in our advocacy efforts towards a government that wasn't really seeing our humanity. So it was just like a lot. And I was like, we need healing and we need it now. And I need to talk directly to people and not talk like I'm like talking in a university, but talk to the people. So that's where tea time started. It was just like, let's have tea, y'all, because I'm having tea. It's helping me. Why don't we have tea together?
I love that. I wish I would have known about you back during the pandemic. On top of everything that was going on for me personally, I was also in an abusive relationship during that time. And, I've done a lot of healing from it now, but that would have been beautiful to have that type of resource because, like you said, we all felt so alone, especially being in that type of relationship. I felt so alone. So I appreciate you for starting a movement that it's still going today. And I know it's helping a lot of people. So shout out to you.
Thank you for saying that. And shout out to you for
Thank you.
deciding to, exit a relationship that wasn't serving you. I know that's really hard to do and necessary for any of us who have been in these kinds of entanglements. I talk publicly about, how I found myself in something like that when I was 25 a while ago, but that's a part of why I offer education around toxic abuse cycles and especially the intergenerational ones, like when we see our parents and they have toxicity embedded in their relationship, we see it as the norm. And we don't disrupt it in our generation because we're like, this is what relationships are. No,
Yes.
not
This is what
really.
I knew. Yeah.
Exactly. It's what I saw. It's what was modeled. It's what I knew, but it is not what is healthy.
No. And you are able to break the cycle, like we said before. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you for doing the work, especially for us, because we're such an underserved community. And to have someone in this field that looks like us and talks like us, we can relate to. We need so many more of women and men like you. So again, thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I'm so proud to show up for my communities. Like, I agree. Like, my parents, like, with all of their making me pull my hair out behaviors, they also have been doing a lot of the work that they can tolerate to do in their generation. Like, it doesn't look like what my sister and I do as millennials. It looks like what they do as boomers. And one might think it's not enough, but it is a lot for them. And I see it and I'm like, it's even for them. It's even for the abuelitos and abuelitas and the older generations that never had any kind of tool or model for actually doing the healing. They matter too. And I want them to heal too, like how my parents are healing. Because I know a lot of us are like, let's heal in this generation so the next generation doesn't have to suffer, but also so that we can teach, even if it's a tiny thing, the previous generations how to feel more at ease in the bodies and in the minds that they exist in because they need it too.
Yes. And I've said this before on my show. I can hold compassion for the generations before me because they knew what they knew when they knew it. And I can't hold that against them. I can only be like, you did the best that you could when you were in whatever situation, but now we're able to shift the narrative, to shift the cycle, to do all these things with the resources that we have today. And I don't need to hold it against my parents anymore. I don't need to have that resentment or that anger or like, oh, why couldn't you do things differently? It's like, no, it's a different generation and that's okay. But us having these conversations is how we're able to break the cycle and bring awareness and heal the intergenerational trauma that we're all dealing with.
Yeah. The other day I was actually having a conversation with my mom and my dad, but directing my words at my mom. And I was like, Mom, why can't you just like change that behavior? Why can't you like be different, in reference to that? I'm literally telling you right now what you need to do to change, right? And then in that same conversation, because I don't know, I got some insight. I wonder, like, maybe it was my grandma, but I never really thought about this before. And I was like, wait, my mom was raised for most of her life by her aunt. And then I thought back to what I remember about her aunt. And she was like,
Yeah.
not the healthiest.
Yeah.
I even told my mom, I'm like, she was kind of like chismosita, I'm like, Mom, you don't have to be like her anymore. Like, you don't have to be like that. Although I'm telling my mom all of this, at the same time, I'm also thinking, my poor mom. That sucks to have been raised by somebody who had that kind of personality, let's call it. Right? Like, it just that you as a child, you're being molded on how to be as a human by a person that themselves has not done the work and can be not very kind. And so even though I'm sitting here trying to lecture my mother, at the same time, I'm also kind of like taking a step back and thinking, oh my gosh, if I were to have someone like that raise me and live in a state of survival since I was a kid, I probably would be behaving like my mom is right now too, because she is stuck in survival mode. And I'm like, yeah, So I stepped back from the conversation. I'm like, okay, that's all I've got, because I was like, okay, I need to like hold compassion because that sucks. And I kind of get it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that compassion and being able to, put yourself in someone else's shoes, I think that's so beautiful. And it's definitely something that I'm trying to actively do more as I'm on my own personal development journey. And like I said before, like my mom, love her to death. And I know that she could do more, she can do better, but that's her journey to take on if she decides to do so. And if not, that's okay too.
hmm It kind of makes you think like, what's their best, right? Like versus what's the best, period. Because that's basically based on our standards as millennials who have one, been raised in a completely different era that has completely different values, that has technology at our disposal, that has healing tools that we can actually like literally click on the internet and like have a host of different ways that we can heal. They didn't have any of that. They didn't even have like popularized and somewhat destigmatized mental health and mental health clinicians accessible to them. They had like people telling them like, if you feel depressed and you're a local and you got to go to like some institution, like that's such a different way of orienting around your emotions than the ways that we've been oriented and socialized. And so when you start thinking about all those different layers, it really does layer the compassion.
Absolutely. And I know one of the resources that's going to come out very soon is your book, which I see in your background. I love that for you so much. Again,
Thank
y'all, she's
you.
an author with the book titled Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. So she has step-by-step process for everyone out there. And without giving too much away, because I definitely want people to pre-order and order your book when it comes out, just share some practical tips, maybe 3 or 4, that you would tell someone, especially in the beginning of the healing journey, from whatever it is that they're healing from, whether it's like for me, I was in an abusive relationship or, healing from family trauma. What would you say are the 3 most important steps in the beginning that one should focus on?
I love this question. I don't think I've gotten this specific question. And what is going to be most critical is point one is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that you're in pain, acknowledgement that you've been even a cycle keeper, as I call some of us or all of us, before we actually are awakened to the fact that we are basically like in cycles of pain and we no longer wish to be there, or we no longer deserve to be there, or we never deserve to be there, but we just didn't have the consciousness around it. It's the acknowledgement. It's the saying like, hold up, this is not healthy, or hold up, I don't have to be suffering this way. And from there, then we can get into the point of healing. And so step one of healing is always going to be, how do you feel the emotions that you're carrying inside of your body? and let's basically go back to your body and find ways to settle your nervous system so that you can feel more at ease and also more prepared for the journey ahead, because the journey ahead is going to be one in which your nervous system is going to be like, oh my goodness, I just uncovered another layer. This feels
Girl.
awful.
Yes.
To be honest, I'm very, very cautious with trauma healing. I'm like really gentle, really cautious. And a part of the reason is because if we're not doing the work from a very intentional place, it can be very re-traumatizing. And I've actually had people come to me from having worked with a coach or like someone who basically started diving into their trauma and not having the trauma responsive training that is essential, to like really orient them. And they're like coming to me like in shambles, right? Because the steps were not taken into consideration, the intention of like how to move through a process that's so heavy and so incredibly like unnerving and could be re-traumatizing if not done with enough like care, intention, and knowledge. And so like, I'm always really, really cautious. And I was even cautious while writing the book and how I approach the work with folks so that we could also have a better streamline of like how to get into those roots of pain, but from a place where it feels tolerable enough to even touch our stories.
Absolutely. I appreciate that so much. I just think about my own healing journey from the trauma that I went through back from 2020 in that abusive relationship. It was a very traumatic way that it ended. Not even just that relationship, but the relationships beforehand that were very toxic and some were abusive. Like healing from that, I feel like people think that healing is like, well, not everyone, but a lot of people in society think that it's like this beautiful, like, oh, I'm going to sit in a Zen space and just meditate and, all these things. But true healing is painful, can be re traumatizing. It is going to that deep, dark place that we don't want society to know about. Our inner shadows, as the people in the spiritual world talk about. So I would love for you to talk about one, why does healing from trauma hurt? And two, how would you encourage someone to maintain the momentum and the motivation through the ups and downs of the healing journey that we go through? Because it is they say there's ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys. It's not comfortable. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, a lot of why it hurts is because we're going into the most vulnerable and tender parts of ourselves. Usually, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about moments primarily where we felt like our life was in danger or some aspect of ourselves was in danger. And so if we're basically going back to those places and saying, what happened? That means that your body is going to basically think that it's back in that space when you're telling the story. The reason why my work is holistic and integrates nervous system restoration as part one of the work is because of how it can be so incredibly hard to dive into our stories when we don't have the tools that can actually help us to settle. So, what can give a person an opportunity for longevity in terms of their trauma healing is to actually do it in chunks that honor how their body is internalizing their story. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're building out your family tree. And in your family tree, you're noting how I note in the book for people to do, like you're noting, okay, well, this was my grandmother's trauma response. And this was my uncle's trauma response. And this is how it impacted my mother. And now that's the way that I respond to stress. And you're diving into so many of those interconnected trauma responses in your family line to actually stay with that point of inquiry, to literally sit with that information and continue the data collection process that you'll need, to just like understand, okay, what happened here? What happened through the generations? You have to feel safe enough to do that in your body, meaning that you have to feel like what you're uncovering is tolerable for you to actually internalize and understand. And how do you find it tolerable? typically what I tend to do with folks is that I pair the actual like data collection process, meaning like what happened and like getting into the details, with a relaxation process. I guide folks through a sound bath meditation, a meditation. I guide them through deep breathing. I help them to reconnect with their generational resilience so that they can remember. You have the strength to carry you through this healing process, right? Like it's all of those things that are going to help a person to then find their way, through the journey without feeling like they need to close the book and then avoid.
Yeah, I love that so much. I remember one time I went to a therapist. This was years ago, and this was when I was very much anti-therapy, like, "Oh, that's not for me. That's for crazy people." That's the mentality that I had. But I was going through a lot of things with the end of the relationship with my daughter's father. And I went to see this therapist. One, he was an old white man, so we didn't relate at all. And then two, he had me do this exercise on our first session. We don't have any sort of rapport. You don't know anything about me. I'm sitting in this room with him and he takes out a stuffed animal and he tells me to talk to my inner child. And I'm just like, what the fuck? Like, this is so weird. Like, and that completely turned me off. I never went back to him ever again. I swore off therapy for like probably a decade until I went through what I went through back in 2020. And I was like, okay, I need professional help. Let's try this again. And luckily I found a Latino, young, Hispanic. He really helped me a lot. But I just share that to say therapy and healing, like it's not a one size fits all. And it's important for you to, even if you do have a not so great experience with one person, don't do what I did and completely run away from it. Like give it another chance, find someone new. There's something out there for everyone. And sometimes you got to kiss a couple frogs before you meet the prince, right?
Beautifully stated and very true. And I'm so sorry for the experience that you had. And
Thank you.
unfortunately, so it happens to be the experience for many of us, including myself as a clinician in training. I entered a process where I wanted to also still be in therapy and process like what I was learning and kiss my own set of frogs and finally landed at a person of color who has been my therapist for almost a decade. So I've been very, very lucky. And I think it's part of the journey that you have to like kind of like date therapists. But what sucks about it is that for us, people of color, dating therapists also means trying to gauge if they are culturally fluent and won't cause racial and ethnic harm upon us, whether that's, discriminating upon us, if it's micro or macroaggressions, or if it's flat out racism. We have to also screen for that, which is really frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely like the dating world. You have to do your research, and if something doesn't work out, it's okay to pivot to the next one. So, thank you for sharing your experience as well. Okay, so we are talking about misconceptions and stigmas and things like that around therapy and healing, and especially in our communities of color. So, how do you address or break down these barriers in your work, and how can we as a society do the same?
A part of how I started to disrupt the barriers that exist is by hopping on social media. I mean, I'm like one of the OGs that was here, like the sprinkles of therapists that were here like a very long time ago, doing a lot of the educational work. And in part, like many of us were doing that because not because we wanted to be Insta famous or anything like that, because that wasn't even a thing back then. It was literally because like a lot of us held on to the frustration of people don't have this information and there's too much stigma out there. We must find a way to destigmatize by offering information, but also offering tools and tips and something that people can have outside of these like um, institutions that we're all a part of, the medical centers, the programs, the therapy or doctoral programs, like all of it, where the information isn't going out into the community. I would come home. At that time, my parents were still living in Newark, and I would come home to Newark, and I'm like, I'm coming from Columbia University, right? Can you imagine the world of difference between being in these like elite institutions where people are basically talking about us, not knowing us at all, and talking about us and how you provide therapy to Black and Latina and even other people of color, not having a single, even a friend of color, not even like having any kind of exposure growing up, going to, all white schools or places where we were never reflected. I'm coming home and I'm like with my family and with friends, and I'm like, what is going, like, the disconnection was wild. I was like, this is not okay. It's not okay. Like, we deserve that information too. And we deserve to be speaking on behalf of our communities, or at the very least, have the cultural fluency to be able to talk about how our communities can heal in spaces that weren't designed for us, or where our voices aren't prominent and represented. I know there's a couple of us that are trying to do that work and have been for some time. And I'm very explicit about that. Like, I'm tired of, people that don't look like us telling me what our healing needs to look like, because they've never stepped foot in Newark, New Jersey, ever.
Facts,
Unless it's like,
girl.
right. They
Yes.
have no idea what that life
No
is like.
idea.
And if people like might think, okay, well, she's, moved up in the world and now she's like, not even like, I live literally like 3 minutes away from Newark. I'm very close to my community. I need to be around my people. Like, for us that have to operate in these spaces and like hear people talk about us like we're these like foreign objects, that to me was really striking. It almost kind of like created a motivating rage in me to then move forward with the work and like make sure that my voice was heard, and that I got those letters behind my name so that I could step into spaces and say, I'm a Columbia University-trained doctor, right? So that I can literally use that to ensure that I had access to then say the things that are essential to say on behalf of my communities and the ways that we deserve to be healing. So it was like a plot.
Yes.
It was
She
like,
did it for the plot, y'all.
I did it for the plot. I did it for the
Yes.
culture. And yeah, like I needed to ensure, like for some of us, there's no other way.
Yeah, I love that. The power of using your voice, especially in a community that is so lacking, and you being, you know what, if I don't see this, I'm going to create it and I'm going to bring people along with me. That is so powerful. That is a takeaway that I'm getting from that. So shout out to you, sis. You are out here changing lives and helping people and, through your passion and your purpose. I love that.
I'm grateful for the life that I lead. It's very imperfect, and I have my experiences of trouble, but I feel like a lot of what I went through, it really has helped me to be able to carry the work in a way that I know a lot of my colleagues cannot. Like, there's these people that are so prominent in the world of mental health and in the world of trauma, and wouldn't have a single clue as to what it's like to grow up and be like 16 years old, just walking with your friend in Newark, New Jersey, and all of a sudden you're, in a corner where there's a shootout. Like, they don't know this. They don't understand it. They don't understand what it's like for young Latina or Black girls to grow up feeling like your local street pharmacist is like the guy to aspire to like be with, right? And like the different layers tied into that, also around poverty, but also around like culturally, kind of like what the cultural language is around that. Like, they have no clue. They have no clue. They don't know hip hop. They don't, like, it's just like, it's a whole mess. It takes people like myself and other therapists that are out here really doing the work from a cultural place and a decolonized place to really disrupt that and say, you don't really know my story. Like, I have a different story, and my story actually relates to a lot of the people that look like me or come from my backgrounds. And we need these stories out there because they have value too.
Yes, amen. That's why I wanted you to come on. When I looked you up and I was like, ooh, this is somebody that needs to come on the podcast. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your gems. That lived experience, it hits different, right?
Mm-hmm. It does. I can sit in a room with someone. My training, almost all of it, and also my first job were all in Washington Heights. And it was, Washington Heights is 95% Black and Latina. And that was literally, we had like maybe 2 non-Black and Latina people in the entire clinic for all those years that I was there, as far as clients are concerned, patients. I was the first Black Latina to ever have been hired by that institution, and for the entirety of how long Columbia University Medical Center has existed.
Wow.
I was like, what is this? Like, this should never be, you know? But also, you look at the people in the lobby that are there to receive services, they look like my tío, my mom, literally my family. And even in the book, I say there was this one incident. I was like, you ever got flushed like with embarrassment and
Oh,
like you're like,
absolutely.
yo, your whole body is like hot, right? Because I was in the lobby and my cousin was like, Mariel. And she's like, she's like flagging me. And I'm like, oh my God, my cousin's here. And so in therapy, like they teach you, you have to be a blank slate. You can't show emotion. If somebody like is talking to you, like you have to like have a certain posture, all this BS that's not culturally derived at all. And I went to my supervisors, both of whom are also Latine. One is Cuban, one is Puerto Rican. And they were like, welcome to community psychology. This is our people we're helping. So, they're going to be around. And my cousin lived like 3 blocks away, So, like, of course, she's going to go to a clinic that's 3 blocks away. And that's going to be a point of interaction for us. But I felt so validated with the fact that I could be myself around the people that I seek to serve and not operate under these Eurocentric ideas of like how we need to do therapy that are distancing, disconnecting, and isolating to the people in our communities.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, since we're talking about, community and healing and all of that, I would love to hear what you have in your brain when can you paint a picture of what you think a healed, trauma-free community might look like? I know not everyone's going to be 100% trauma-free, but we can have some wishful thinking. And what do you think changes that you hope to see as us as a collective when it comes to the result of collective healing from trauma?
Oh, such good questions. Thank you for these. The world is a world that is deep in trauma, and trauma is a part of also the human experience in some regards. I mean, the World Health Organization recently put out a recent statistic about trauma indicating that about 70% of the world's population would experience at least one traumatic incident in their lives.
I feel like that would be more than 70.
I think there's way more than 70 for sure, but I think we also have to consider what happens with research is that not everybody in every sector of the population responds, and some people under appraise their trauma, because also they don't want to kind of like affiliate with the word trauma. So there's a lot there, but I agree with you. I think there's a lot more. Given that understanding, I do believe that it is likely impossible for the entirety of the world to be trauma free. But I do believe that we can exist in a world, even in the short term, that is trauma responsive and that really identifies ways in which we can proactively have a trauma based understanding, meaning that we go into the schools and we actually teach young minds about how to actually work with mindfulness and meditation and their nervous system and what can be traumatic. We teach them also in the health classes or whatever, those classes are where they're taught about tobacco, but they're not taught about toxic relationships and the ways in which those can also be detrimental to their organ system and to their health, right? So we need to go into the school systems and do that teaching. We need to go even before the school system. We need to actually create more spaces for caregivers to have better attunement with their children at those very tender moments when attachment wounds are being created or when healthy attachments are being created, and try and get the attunement fine-tuned between parent and child. And this is all like preventative kind of like or proactive kind of things that we can do. But then we can also be a responsive society from a reactive place, meaning when we understand that trauma has occurred. For example, we had an entire pandemic with so much pain that was also layered on top of that, especially if you were a person of color. And especially because within the pandemic, communities of color were disproportionately impacted by COVID and disproportionately dying based on COVID. So we had more losses, more grief, right? And so when you think about all of that, like, you would think that as a world, we would mobilize from a trauma responsive place. We would mobilize to help heal the world from the wound of this ongoing, prolonged, and extensive and really gut wrenching crisis. We didn't. We said, okay, we're fine now. Open the floodgates. Like everybody come in, go back to work, go back to school. And nobody is like really taking the moment to say, we need some healing. So what happens? A global mental health crisis. That's what happens, where everybody's like, actually, we're not okay. And now you have skyrocketing depression, anxiety, suicidality, and you have an insurmountable right now, like youth global mental health crisis where the kids are hurting. And so we need to also be responsive in the moments when, like right now, that we're experiencing a lot of these like words in society and these images around war and genocide and like what's happening, in all these areas of the world. We need to have a trauma response in place. So we need to like do the healing. We need to open up mental health facilities and have institutions that have power and dollars to pour into the mental health initiatives and mental health facilities so that we can actually pay therapists to do their job. And then we can also increase the pipeline of therapists so that we're not overburdened with 6-month wait lists where we can't even like let people into our doors because we already have all 40 slots filled. It's a whole mess, but that's the short answer.
In a perfect world, right? In a perfect world. But I think just a small thing that can really help is what me and you are doing right now, sitting down and having the conversation, having the open dialogue and allowing other people to hear what we're saying. And hopefully that can start, you know what? I heard this. Let's have this conversation. You go to your family. I heard this podcast today and I really want to sit down and talk about some real shit. Just having that open dialogue, that can be the small stepping stone to the bigger picture that I'm sure now in this generation with the Gen Zs and the millennials, like we are definitely changing the narrative, but it's going to take some time. But for us to be open enough to have these uncomfortable conversations, that can be the starting point for healing for a lot of us.
Yeah. And every bit that we deposit into that healing pool, it creates a ripple effect. And so none of us can really take for granted, however small our efforts might be, the impact that they could have.
Absolutely. Your voice matters, y'all. So use it, okay?
Yes, love that.
So I want to ask, since you're on the Watch Us Thrive podcast, tell me, what does thriving mean to you?
Thriving to me is moments of balance and peace. I feel like that's thriving. I actually have like this semi long term goal of transitioning into living off of the land, living in a way that really centers me. Even though I do some of that now, but I do it in a very kind of industrialized New Jersey town, right? And so I want to go back to my roots and I want to have a hammock and have a rocking chair like my grandmother and listen to the ocean sounds where I grew up. I want to do those things. And I feel like that's thriving to me. That was my mother's dream. My mother always, since we were little, she would say, well, when you go off to college and you go live your lives, I'm going to retire in DR. And she never had the money to do that because, she was a beautician. She didn't make enough money. So I'm like, no, we're going to find a way to live that dream, to go back home.
Yeah, I love that. That's definitely going to happen for you. So thank you so much for sharing that. All right. So one piece of advice you would share your childhood self, whatever age pops up for you, being the woman that you are today and all the things that you've gone through, what would you tell baby Mariel?
I would say your voice is gold. Like, say what you need to say. Don't shrink.
Yes, I love that. Use your voice, y'all. That's the theme of this conversation. Speak up. I love that. So, what would you want to be your biggest takeaway for anyone listening to this conversation?
Well, I want us to understand that every single day presents with an opportunity for us to break the cycle. We literally just have to take that opportunity. We have to take it. And I mean that wholeheartedly. Every day is presented with an opportunity of like, how are you going to respond to that person that always pushes your buttons? You can respond differently by not reacting to them in the ways that traditionally you have, and respond from a place where, you're honoring your more healed self and the new values that you're establishing for yourself. Every single day gives us a chance.
I'm going to play that back anytime I get triggered by my mom. Like, let me think before I speak.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. Dr. Mariel, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise and your wisdom. I know my audience is going to want to know more about you, work with you, follow you, and also plug in your book that's coming out and anything else you'd like for us to know as we wrap up the conversation.
Yes, this has been so lovely. My work can all be found at drmarielbuqué.com. And also my book, Break the Cycle, is linked on there for all of us.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to link it in the show notes so you guys can purchase it. And please, y'all, share this conversation with anyone that you know. Leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and continue following along because she is out here changing the world one conversation at a time. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for your incredible work, too.
Thank you.